War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 83, the Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on 18 June 1815, stands as one of the most significant military engagements in history, marking the end of the Napoleonic Wars and terminating the political and military career of Napoleon Bonaparte. The battle brought to a close more than 2 decades of nearly uninterrupted conflict on the continent. The confrontation between Napoleon's Armée du Nord and the forces of the 7th Coalition, primarily the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, is rightly the capstone for Creasy's 15 decisive battles and was probably the impetus for the book. Napoleon, whom I hope to go into details later, inspired both Jomini and Clausewitz to dive into the art and science of war to understand why Napoleon was so successful, this battle notwithstanding. Following his abdication in 1814, Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, while the victorious Allied parties gathered at the Congress of Vienna to restructure post-war Europe. Dissatisfied with his diminished status and capitalizing on political divisions among the Allies, Napoleon escaped Elba in February 1815. His return to France, known as the 100 Days, triggered the formation of the 7th Coalition, comprising major European powers including Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Despite their differences, the Allies shared a common objective: the removal of Napoleon and the restoration of stability. Napoleon's first objective was to consolidate his authority within France. Once this was achieved to a sufficient degree, he sought to confront the coalition forces before they could fully concentrate. The Armée du Nord, quickly assembled and well-trained, was intended to strike a decisive blow against the nearest Allied forces, Wellington's Anglo-Allied army in the Low Countries and Blücher's Prussians, before the armies of Austria and Russia could arrive. Napoleon believed that defeating the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies in Belgium would undermine the cohesion of the coalition and possibly force negotiations more favorable to France. To implement this plan, Napoleon marched north towards Belgium in June of 1815. His strategy relied on speed and surprise, aiming to drive a wedge between Wellington and Blücher, defeat each separately, otherwise known as in detail, and then consolidate his defensive position. His army crossed into Belgium on 15 June, moving rapidly through the region and prompting hurried responses from both Allied commanders. 2 engagements on 16 June shaped the course of events leading to Waterloo. At Quatre Bras, elements of the Anglo-Allied army resisted the French left wing under Marshal Ney. Although Ney succeeded in occupying the crossroads initially, he did not dislodge Wellington's forces, and at the same time, Napoleon confronted Blücher at Ligny, achieving a tactical victory and forcing the Prussians to withdraw. Crucially, however, the Prussian army was not destroyed, nor was it pushed eastward towards Prussia, which was Napoleon's hope. Instead, it withdrew north towards Wavre, maintaining the possibility of future cooperation with Wellington. Wellington's decision to retreat to a defensive position south of Brussels, near the village of Waterloo, reflected his assessment that his army was not yet ready for offensive action and that he needed to remain within supporting distance of the Prussians. He selected a ridge just south of the village of Mont-Saint-Jean, offering favorable ground for a defensive battle, which, incidentally, I have seen, and there's a really nice tower, and it's a very interesting place to go if you ever find yourself, tragically, in Belgium. Napoleon, convinced that he could defeat Wellington before the Prussians returned, decided to engage the Anglo-Allied army on 18 June. The Waterloo battlefield consisted of gently rolling farmland. The Anglo-Allied army occupied the reverse slope of Mont-Saint-Jean Ridge, a defensive technique Wellington frequently employed to shield troops from artillery fire. Several key features influenced the battle's progression. On Wellington's right front lay the farm complex of Hougoumont, a large and sturdy structure surrounded by orchards and high walls. Near the center of his line stood Le Haye Saint, a fortified farmhouse held by German troops of the King's German Legion. On the left lay the village of Papelotte and other farms occupied by Dutch, Belgian, and Hanoverian troops. Each of these positions became focal points of the French attacks. Napoleon positioned his forces on the opposite ridge, north of the village of La Belle Alliance. His deployment placed infantry corps under Generals Dru d'Erlon and Rillet on the right and left wings, respectively, with the Imperial Guard held, obviously, in reserve. He also deployed a formidable artillery train, though the soft, rain-soaked ground, due to heavy storms the night before, limited the maneuverability and effectiveness of the cannons in the opening stages. The battle began late in the morning around 11:30, delayed by Napoleon's decision to wait for the ground to dry. The first major action was the French assault on Hougomont, intended as a diversion to draw in Allied reserves. The attack, under General Rillet, quickly escalated into protracted struggle. The British Guards defending Hougomont held the position tenaciously, repelling repeated French attempts to seize the farm. Although Napoleon had not intended Hougomont to become a principal engagement, it absorbed increasingly large numbers of French troops throughout the day, reducing the forces available for the main assaults. Meanwhile, Napoleon prepared his central attack. Around 1:30, d'Erlon's First Corps advanced in massive infantry columns towards the Anglo-Allied left. The French attack initially pushed back the Dutch-Belgium troops, causing disruption in the Allied line. Wellington responded by committing his British infantry units, including brigades under Sir Thomas Picton, to stabilize the position. A fierce infantry engagement ensued, marked by heavy casualties on both sides. In an effort to exploit the temporary unsteadiness of Wellington's line, Napoleon's cavalry commander, Marshal Ney, launched a series of cavalry charges without sufficient infantry or artillery support. Ney's interpretation of Allied movements convinced him that Wellington was withdrawing, prompting him to order cuirassiers and lancers into action prematurely. These massive, heavy cavalry assaults, though visually impressive, proved largely ineffective. Wellington's infantry squares, tight formations designed specifically to resist cavalry, held firm across most of the line. Artillery fire, when possible, inflicted significant damage on the French horsemen, as the charges repeatedly failed to break the Allied formations. The cavalry assaults consumed valuable French manpower and exhausted their horses, all while failing to alter the tactical situation. Unquestionably, the French failure to properly pursue the Prussians during the previous engagement hung heavily in Ney's mind. He did not want to miss the opportunity for a decisive victory versus a mediocre and temporary win. La Haie-Sainte, held by 400 soldiers of the King's German Legion, stood at the center of the battlefield and became a decisive point of contention. Its defenders, armed largely with rifles, providing extended range, held off French attacks for much of the afternoon. The farmhouse served as an anchor for Wellington's center and an obstacle to French attempts to bring artillery forward. By late afternoon, however, the defenders' ammunition had nearly run out. Around 6 p.m., French troops finally captured La Haie-Sainte after intense fighting. This success allowed the French to deploy artillery closer to Wellington's line, opening a gap in the center. The situation for the Anglo-Allied army became precarious. Wellington himself acknowledged that he had reached the limit of what his force could endure without reinforcements. He is famously quoted as saying, "Night or Blücher." The decisive factor that determined the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo was the arrival of the Prussian army on Napoleon's right flank. Field Marshal Blücher, despite personal injuries sustained at Ligny, was determined to support Wellington as promised. The Prussian Fourth Corps, under General Friedrich Wilhelm Bülow, approached the battlefield first, reaching the areas east of the village of Plassans in the late afternoon. Napoleon was forced to divert elements of his reserves, including young and middle guard units, to counter the Prussian advance. Fierce fighting erupted in Plassans as the Prussians attempted to push the French rear. The commitment of French reserves to this sector reduced the forces available for operations against Wellington and compromised Napoleon's ability to deliver a decisive blow anywhere. By about 6:30 p.m., significant numbers of Prussian troops under Generals Perch and Zieten were joining the action on Wellington's left. This cooperation between the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies, something Napoleon had tried to prevent from the outset, materially altered the balance of forces on the battlefield. Facing increasing pressure from the Prussians, and recognizing that the window for decisive action was closing, Napoleon committed the Imperial Guard, his most elite and respected troops, to an assault on Wellington Center. The decision was made late in the day, around 7:30 or 8 p.m. The middle guard advanced up the slope of Mont Saint-Jean in well-formed columns, aiming to break the Anglo-Allied line and trigger a general collapse. Wellington, expecting this attack, deployed his remaining reserves to reinforce the threatened sector. British Guard regiments, concealed behind the crest of the ridge, rose and delivered concentrated volleys at close range. The effect was devastating. The Imperial Guard, stunned by the sudden intensity of fire, wavered and eventually retreated. In what became one of the most symbolically resonant moments of the battle, the Guard, long thought invincible, was forced back down the slope. Although some units withdrew in good order, the overall attack failed. With the repulse of the Guard, the morale of the French army collapsed. Rumors circulated that the Guard had been destroyed, and many French units began to withdraw or flee. Wellington ordered a general advance, and the combination of Anglo-Allied and Prussian pressure shattered the cohesion of the French forces. Napoleon attempted to rally his troops, but soon recognized the hopelessness of the situation. The French retreat turned into a rout as the remnants of the Armée du Nord withdrew to the south. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo saw the disintegration of Napoleon's military capabilities. The campaign had ended decisively. Napoleon returned to Paris, where political support suddenly evaporated. Within days, he abdicated for the second time. He surrendered to British authorities in July and was subsequently exiled to the island of St. Helena, where he lived until his death in 1821. Casualties on both sides were extremely high. Estimates vary, but Napoleon's forces may have suffered more than 25,000 killed or wounded, with additional thousands captured or missing. The Anglo-Allied army incurred similar losses, while the Prussians suffered another 7,000 to 8,000 casualties. These figures underscore the ferocity of the combat. The outcome of Waterloo has far-reaching political consequences. When Napoleon removed, the Bourbon monarchy was restored to France, and the reconfigured European political order established by the Congress of Vienna was secured. The battle symbolized the triumph of collective European action over individual ambition and reinforced principles of stability and balance that guided European diplomacy for decades. Militarily, Waterloo has been analyzed as an example of the importance of coordination between Allied forces, the impact of terrain and weather on operations and tactics, and the decisive effects of reserves when committed at the critical moment. Wellington's defensive tactics, including the use of reverse slope, demonstrated the value of carefully chosen ground. Napoleon's failure to prevent the junction of Wellington and Blucher has often been cited as the central strategic failure of the campaign. Historians continue to debate specific decisions: Ney's premature cavalry attacks, delay in launching assaults on Wellington's center, and the allocation of reserves to counter the Prussians. With the arrival of the Prussians, Napoleon, who was famously ill during the battle, was torn in determining what was the tactical center of gravity of the Allies. Was it the fresh Prussians with mobility, or the determined but tired British in the defensive? In the end, Napoleon attacked both and failed accordingly. The Battle of Waterloo can also be understood within the broader evolution of European warfare. It represented the culmination of the Napoleonic style of war: mass conscript armies, rapid maneuver, and concentrated force, confronting increasingly coordinated multinational coalitions. The effectiveness of Wellington and Blucher's cooperation foreshadowed the multinational alliances that would characterize European military coalitions in the following century. Additionally, Waterloo marked a transition from Revolutionary-era conflict to the more conservative, stability-oriented politics of the 19th century. The victory of the coalition powers reinforced the legitimacy of monarchies and helped shape nearly 40 years of relative peace in Europe, known as the Concert of Europe. Although tensions and conflicts would eventually return, the long-term diplomatic framework created during this period was highly influential in managing European relations for a generation. The Battle of Waterloo remains one of the most studied engagements in world history due to its scale, its consequences, and the prominence of the commanders involved. As a military event, it demonstrates the interplay of strategy, leadership, tactical doctrine, and circumstance. Napoleon's plan to defeat the Allied armies before they could combine was theoretically sound, but ultimately faltered due to miscommunication, miscalculation, and the resilience of his opponents. Wellington's defensive preparation and steadfast command enabled the Anglo-Allied army to withstand hours of intense pressure by some of the finest troops in history, while Blucher's determination ensured that the Prussians arrived in time to influence the outcome decisively. As an event marking the end of an era, Waterloo signaled the final collapse of the Napoleonic Empire and shaped European politics for generations. Its legacy extends beyond military history into cultural memory, national identity, and the study of leadership and decision-making. In its complexity and consequence, the battle stands as a defining moment in world history. And with this, we close on Creasy's 15 decisive battles. Please let me know if you want to continue along this vein with more modern famous battles or transition to different subjects.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.